Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe as you are new. It is the coldest day in the history of the world today. Fact. So as a result, you are seeing the Boxing Gossip coat make another appearance on the channel. I'm back today to record another Patreon request, which was from friend of the channel, Daz. So Daz, you know who you are. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the support. Thanks for the Patreon request. And I'm hoping that the topic that Daz has suggested is a Patreon request that several people will find interesting. It was quite a simple request. He asked me to discuss the life and times of Mr. Audley Harrison, which we're going to do in this video. It's not going to be a video with a simple start, middle and end. I'm not going to come to any sort of profound conclusions and happy endings to the story. But over the course of this video, I'm going to share a couple of personal memories I have from Audley Harrison's career and just what I kind of think of when I look back on the career. So I guess let's start by sharing some of my early Audley Harrison memories. Now, Harrison won the Olympic medals the Olympic gold medal in Sydney Olympics in 2000. Now, at the time of that, I was a youngster. I had an interest in boxing, but I certainly wasn't filming YouTube videos. YouTube probably didn't even exist back then, and I wasn't following the sport with the same dedication I am now. But I actually remember Audley Harrison's gold medal victory, and I actually remember his first professional fight quite well, and both of them stick with me. My parents had taken myself and my brother, and they were going to buy a new TV. This was the day that Audley won the Olympic gold medal. And I don't know if it's still done this way, but can you kind of picture that old school TV setup where you have like a wall of TVs and every TV is on the same channel? I vividly remember this. My parents were chatting away, talking about which TV they were going to buy, and myself and my brother, who would have been both under 10 years old at the time, sat watching the Audley Harrison gold medal fight across 50 TVs, all playing the same thing at the same time. It kind of stuck with me. So I vividly remember Audley winning gold, and I vividly remember the excitement when he turned professional and when he had his first fight. His first fight, I'll never forget the guy's name, was against Michael Middleton. And I remember watching the fight live on TV, it would have been on the BBC, with my grandmother, who I must have been staying with that weekend or something. Now, unfortunately, she died relatively recently, but it's actually quite a nice memory to think back of it and think of me as a youngster watching Audley Harrison smash up a journeyman at my grandmother's house when I was a lot younger. And I remember Audley won the fight. I haven't box wrecked this. I think it was probably in the first round. It may have been in the second round. He made very, very easy work of Michael Middleton. And at the time, as someone who was a young child, didn't really have an appreciation of the boxing scene, I kind of viewed Audley Harrison as a bit of an unstoppable force and someone who was destined for very, very big things. He was doing a lot of television at the time. The Sydney Olympics were massive. Obviously, he was a gold medalist, and I remember him popping up constantly on the TV. I don't know if it was just news programs or if it was other TV programs and that sort of thing. But I constantly remember hearing about Audley. And another memory that sticks with me is even when I was probably 10 years old, there were times, even as a 10-year-old, I promise you I'm not making this up, I remember looking at him on TV and thinking, the way this guy talks is a little bit odd. I vividly remember, and I can't tell you what program it was probably some sort of kids TV program where he was featuring on it, but I'm vividly remembering him sitting there talking about focus and just going on and on and on about his focus and what a deep thinker he was. And even at the time, even when I was like 9 or 10 or 8, however old I was, I remember thinking like it's kind of odd the way this guy speaks. But I was watching his career develop with interest. The way he'd won the gold medal, the way he'd taken care of Michael Middleton, and he had that BBC contract where he fought a very, very low level of opposition, and I would have watched many, many, many of those fights as a youngster. I can't tell you that I remember them as vividly as his gold medal win, and I can't tell you I remember them as vividly as his professional debut. But nevertheless, that was an interesting time for British boxing. There was the infamous Herbie Hyde riot at York Hall, which I've even watched recently, probably watched that a year or two ago on YouTube, just looking back on it kind of open-mouthed at what was going on. And Audley Harrison was also the person I had my first ever boxing bet on. For some reason, and I can't remember why, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Danny Williams. I think Danny Williams, he must have had some fights broadcast on terrestrial TV, and maybe my dad had let me stay up on Saturday nights and watch him fight a few times. And I vividly remember Danny Williams versus Audley Harrison. And myself and my dad had a 50p bet. I said Danny Williams will win the fight. My dad said Audley Harrison will win the fight. And I even remember the conversation now. And I don't know how old I'd have been. Maybe 11, 12, something like that. And my dad was saying, Danny Williams is like a solid fighter at British level, but he's not a classy boxer. Audley's got that pedigree, And for some reason, I don't know why, I just thought, I had an instinct that Danny Williams was going to win that fight. And I remember watching it, and it was I think it was a pretty horrible fight. I remember it being close on the scorecards, but Danny Williams nicked it, and I won my first ever bet on boxing. I won 50p off my dad when Danny Williams beat Audley Harrison. And that led to a sort of spiraling gambling addiction on boxing that has cost me an arm and a leg ever since. But nevertheless, another powerful Audley Harrison memory. And as I sat down to create this video, it actually occurred to me that whilst Audley isn't someone I consider one of my favourite fighters, whilst Audley isn't someone I've done a lot of videos on since I created this channel, in terms of just the pure memories, I have a lot of memories with my family actually watching Audley Harrison on his way up. As I say, watching that Olympics with my brother, his debut with my grandmother, the Danny Williams fight with my dad. It was almost quite nice looking back on it all. After that Danny Williams fight, there was then the slight fall from grace. There was the loss to Dominic Gwynn. There were some other losses as well at the time. He kind of became a bit of a strange figure, I felt. He seemed very bitter and twisted about the loss of the BBC contract, really wanting to be his own promoter and, not sign deals with any of the other guys. And he became bitter and twisted. I remember another sort of press conference. I think it must have been the Danny Williams rematch press conference where it all kicked off, and there was a lot of tension between the two guys, and they were running around backstage, etc. And it all became a fairly sad ending for Audley Harrison. I remember conversations with my dad, and my dad was so frustrated when we were watching him fight. My dad just thought he was too tentative. He always looked kind of nervous in there. In some ways you could maybe compare it to a David Price type fighter. I know, David Price and Audley fought later on. We maybe will touch on that later on in this video. But you kind of look back on Audley, and a lot of his performances were just, frankly, they were timid. He looked scared in there. He looked like he was anxious not to engage. And I think, unfortunately, that was a recurring theme throughout the course of his professional career. And something that kind of led to people losing interest in him. And I think by the time he'd taken the Danny Williams loss, by the time he'd taken the Dominic Gwynn loss, I think around the same period he maybe lost to Martin Rogan, Michael Sprott. And he just started to put in routinely subpar performances. And it was a case of wasted potential. Harrison was this massive guy. He was 6'5", and 6'5" was a lot bigger in the heavyweight division in those days than it is in these days. And he was a big puncher. He was a southpaw. He had that Olympic gold medal, and it felt like a case of real wasted potential with Harrison. He was, I don't know if he was a hype job, but the hype around Harrison was maybe an early version of the hype that later surrounded other Olympic heavyweights like David Price or like Anthony Joshua. And it felt that he hadn't sort of lived into that expectation. And he was very much in that British heavyweight mix at the time of like your Michael Sprotts, your Danny Williamses, your Matt Skeltons, your Audleys. He was very much in that mix. You look at the British scene now, you've got guys like Fury, Hay, Joshua, Dillian White. These are guys who have had a lot more success at world level than those guys. And you kind of felt that Audley should be the one to kind of break out of that group of British fighters and be the one to go on to world glory. But actually, it was Danny Williams who went and beat Mike Tyson and got the Klitschko fight. Michael Sprott had one or two big fights. Matt Skelton had one or two big fights. Skelton might have even fought Vitali, if I remember correctly. Skelton certainly had one or two big fights back in the day. For Audley, it never really happened. And in actual fact, the only time that he really fought an elite level fighter at any stage of his career was actually when he fought David Haye. And at that point, Audley was, it's probably well too late in his career anyway, because he didn't turn pro as a young man. I think he was in his 30s when he turned pro. Kind of a case of wasted potential. There was then the comebacks. There's the famous story of him playing poker with Eddie Hearn out in Vegas and, striking up a deal with Eddie Hearn and, in a way, kind of launching Matchroom and Eddie Hearn going back into boxing. So perhaps Audley's legacy in 50 years' time will be more about the way he sparked Matchroom's resurgence into boxing and what they've done subsequently rather than his own fights. But he had the 2 wins in Prize Fighter, the 2 big Prize Fighter tournament wins. He had the Michael Sprott win where he put in a fairly appalling performance and was en route to getting soundly beaten by Michael Sprott until he won by stoppage in the last round. And that was a nice sort of resurgence for Audley Harrison, really. He was, in the autumn of his career, but he won Prize Fighter twice. He kind of righted some of the wrongs with Michael Sprott. And it put him in the position to get some really, really good paydays before the end of his career. I almost said heydays, which maybe is a phrase I could have used. And he did secure those paydays on his way out of the sport. But sadly, that's when the nice run continued. There was the woeful performance against David Haye, where he looked so tentative and frankly was a sitting duck for David Haye when David Haye finally decided to put Audley out of his misery. And then there were the sort of desperate comeback attempts against the likes of David Price, who at the time was the next big thing, and Deontay Wilder, who at the time was a prospect having a fight in the UK. And both of those fights ended in fairly terrible fashion for Audley Harrison, losing by devastating knockout. And unfortunately, those will be some of the biggest memories of the Audley Harrison career, especially to people of my generation. It will be that loss to David Price. It will be that loss to David Haye. It will be that loss to Deontay Wilder. Some of those fights probably damaged any sort of legacy that Audley Harrison may have had. But he's a very, very significant figure in boxing, despite his failings. The achievement of the gold medal in the super heavyweight division as a British fighter is a very, very significant and historical achievement. The deal he signed with BBC, the mould he tried to establish of being a self-promoted fighter, which was later copied by the likes of David Haye, etc. That sort of Haye-Harrison fight almost being the death of pay-per-view in Great Britain. The way he kind of got Eddie Hearn into boxing by launching Audley into the Prize Fighter series and creating that, Haye-Harrison scenario. He's a very, very, very significant figure in boxing. He may not have been the greatest boxer ever. He may not have the best legacy ever in terms of what he achieved in the ring, but I actually think his legacy in the sport is probably deeper than his legacy in terms of his resume, if that makes sense. When I look back at Audley Harrison, I will think of him as a talented amateur. I will think of him as a guy who had lots of skills, lots of tools as a professional, but unfortunately I will think of him as someone who maybe didn't fulfill that potential, someone who maybe put in subpar performances in the ring due to tentativeness, due to fragility, and someone who maybe was too much of an egotist and someone who was a bit delusional outside of the ring. Perhaps someone who believed a bit too much in their own hype, and someone who was too busy concentrating on promotional companies and being a deep thinker and being a businessman and appearing on TV shows before he'd even made his professional debut. Maybe new fighters can look at Audley Harrison, learn from him, take some things from what he did and copy it, and maybe learn from his mistakes so that they don't make their own mistakes, so we say. But a very, very, very big character in British boxing, someone who will always bring a smile to the face of people of my generation, or maybe the generation who are slightly older than me, and someone who was in very, very, very memorable nights for some good reasons and for some lesser reasons. Let me know your thoughts. Give me your take in the comment section below. What do you think of when I say the name Audley Harrison? What will be the abiding memories of your career? Hit me up with your thoughts in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this one, hit a thumbs up. If you're new, subscribe. I enjoy doing these Patreon requests because sometimes you get something just a little bit different, and I've kind of enjoyed a little trip down memory lane on this one. Thanks for tuning in, guys. All the best. Stay